In the golden age of Hollywood, when silver screens glimmered like dreams and every star was a myth sculpted by the studio system, there existed a world far removed from the light, a world of whispered truths, coded affection, and forbidden desires. The 1930s were an era where fame meant surveillance, where perfection was demanded, and where one wrong word, one wrong touch, could shatter an empire built on illusion. Amidst that carefully curated paradise, two women dared to feel something real. One was Greta Garbo, a woman the world called divine, a face that could command silence, an actress whose smallest gesture held the weight of poetry. Her beauty was not loud or glittering. It was mysterious, haunting, eternal. She came from the grey streets of Stockholm and rose to become one of the most magnetic forces in cinema. Yet, behind that calm exterior and perfect lighting, she was a fortress of solitude, shy, withdrawn, almost painfully private. Garbo wasn't just an actress. She was an enigma who lived behind invisible walls. The other was Mercedes de Acosta, born into privilege and art, a New York poet, playwright, and socialite with Spanish-Cuban blood and a fire that could not be tamed. She was everything Garbo was not: bold, outspoken, and unwilling to hide who she was. Mercedes lived among the world's greatest artists and dancers, her circle filled with people who shaped modern culture. She was known for her unconventional charm, her elegance, and her refusal to play by society's rules. And in a time when love between women was considered unthinkable, she loved, openly, fiercely, unapologetically. Their paths crossed at a moment when both were searching for something deeper than fame or admiration. Garbo, despite being adored by millions, felt hollow inside, a prisoner of her own legend. Mercedes, though admired for her intellect and beauty, longed for a love that could match her intensity. When they met, it wasn't just an encounter, it was recognition. Two souls drawn together by something unspoken. Imagine the first glance, Garbo's quiet gaze meeting Mercedes' bold eyes across a candlelit room filled with smoke and conversation. History does not record their first words, but it remembers the energy that followed. The poet and the goddess became inseparable, writing letters that would later reveal the magnitude of their connection. Letters that spoke of longing, tenderness, and pain. In those words, we find the truth that Hollywood never dared to show. A love story that existed in fragments, hidden between the pages of time. As the orchestral music swells, picture Garbo on set, bathed in golden light, her expression unreadable, her heart elsewhere, somewhere between reality and the ink on Mercedes' letters. Then, see Mercedes, alone in her study, writing by candlelight, pouring out feelings she could never speak aloud. Their love existed in shadows, but it burned brighter than any spotlight, stronger than any studio's control. This is not the story of scandal. It is the story of courage. Of two women who lived under a system that demanded silence but chose, in their own quiet ways, to speak. Their story would be buried for decades, sealed in envelopes, guarded by fear, until the world was finally ready to understand. In the chill of a Stockholm winter in 1905, a child named Greta Garbo Gustafsson was born into poverty, an ordinary girl who would one day become extraordinary. Her father, a janitor, struggled to keep food on the table, and her mother worked tirelessly in a factory. Yet even as a child, Greta carried an otherworldly stillness, the kind that drew attention without trying. She would later say that she learned to act not from teachers or directors, but from silence itself. That silence would become her signature, a mystery the world could never quite solve. When she stepped into the world of cinema, first in Sweden's The Saga of Gösta Berling, 1924, audiences witnessed the birth of something magnetic. Her presence wasn't loud or theatrical, it was hypnotic. Soon, Hollywood called. And by the time MGM released her first American film, Garbo had already transcended stardom. She was an idea, a fantasy, a goddess. Her expressions spoke entire novels. The camera adored her, but Garbo never seemed to return the affection. She avoided interviews, loathed publicity, and spoke in riddles to reporters. "I want to be alone," she once said, and the world took it as scripture. Across the ocean, another kind of woman was crafting her legend. Mercedes de Acosta, born into a wealthy Spanish-Cuban family in New York City in 1892. She was raised among chandeliers and poetry, surrounded by art and intellect. But Mercedes was no society doll. She was a rebel wrapped in silk. From an early age, she wrote verses that dripped with longing and truth, emotions too bold for her era. Her plays and poems shimmered with sensuality and courage, qualities mirrored in the woman herself. Unlike Garbo's quiet mystique, Mercedes lived in color. She moved through the salons of Manhattan and the artistic enclaves of Greenwich Village with unapologetic grace, her dark eyes alive with curiosity and passion. She was close friends with icons like Isadora Duncan and Eva Le Gallienne, women who, like her, lived outside society's narrow boundaries. And she never pretended to be someone she wasn't. While others whispered about their desires, Mercedes spoke hers aloud. In an age where loving another woman could destroy reputations, she wrote of it, lived it, and refused to hide it. Their worlds collided around 1931, in a New York brimming with jazz, art, and quiet rebellion. Garbo had just completed another film and sought refuge from the unrelenting glare of Hollywood. She often escaped to the city where anonymity was still possible, where she could walk among people who didn't see her as Garbo, but simply as a woman. Mercedes, meanwhile, was already a celebrated figure in the city's bohemian circles, a hostess to artists, dancers, and dreamers who filled her home with conversation and music that lasted until dawn. Through mutual friends, possibly a shared connection to the theater world, they met. The first encounter was brief, almost accidental, but it left a mark neither could forget. Mercedes would later write that the moment Garbo entered the room, the air changed. Garbo's presence, quiet but commanding, drew every gaze, but when her eyes met Mercedes, something unspoken passed between them. It was not love at first sight, it was recognition, a sudden understanding between two lonely souls who saw something of themselves in the other. Garbo, usually guarded and shy, found herself intrigued by this bold, articulate woman who seemed fearless in ways she could never be. Mercedes, on the other hand, was captivated by Garbo's silence, that deep, magnetic quiet that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. From that first meeting, they began a friendship, one that quickly became charged with emotion, curiosity, and tension. They walked the streets of New York together in disguise, dined in quiet cafes, and exchanged letters that hinted at something deeper than friendship. Mercedes was drawn into Garbo's orbit, a world of contradictions where fame met fragility, where every word could be misinterpreted, and where love had to wear a mask. In an age when women like them could not speak their truth aloud, they built a secret world of their own, one stitched together through glances, gestures, and words written in careful ink. It was a connection born not of convenience or curiosity, but of destiny, a meeting of the goddess and the poet, whose love would echo quietly through the corridors of Hollywood history. Between the flicker of candlelight and the hum of old film reels, the truest record of Greta Garbo and Mercedes de Acosta's love was not captured on screen, it was written in ink. More than 180 letters, exchanged over 3 turbulent decades, now rest quietly in the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. They are fragile pages, yellowed with time, but their words still burn, alive with longing, jealousy, tenderness, and the ache of what could never be lived openly. In those letters, the world's most private star became raw, human, vulnerable. Garbo, who barely spoke in public, poured fragments of her heart into carefully chosen phrases. Her sentences were spare but charged with emotion, each one a whisper across time. "I dream of seeing you and of feeling your hands on my face," she wrote. Another letter confessed with devastating simplicity, "I love you. I always have." These were not the words of a distant icon. They were the quiet confessions of a woman yearning to be held. Mercedes, the poet, responded with passion that leapt from the page. Her handwriting, looping and expressive, carried emotion that Garbo could only hint at. She wrote of sleepless nights, of jealous pangs when Garbo drifted into silence, of the torment of loving someone who belonged to the world but never fully to her. She craved closeness, yet knew that too much of it could destroy them both. Their letters reveal a rhythm, a push and pull that lasted decades. Garbo, consumed by her need for privacy, often retreated into silence, leaving Mercedes desperate and confused. Then, just when the poet began to pull away, another letter would arrive. Brief, restrained, but filled with enough warmth to bring her back. Garbo's affection was real, but it came wrapped in caution. She feared exposure, the press, the studio, and perhaps her own feelings. Mercedes wanted a love that could exist in daylight. What they shared instead was a love that could only breathe in the dark. During the 1930s, Hollywood was an empire ruled by image. Actors were property of their studios, bound by contracts that dictated everything from their clothes to their lovers. MGM had invested millions in Garbo's myth, the aloof, untouchable goddess of the screen. To be caught in a same-sex affair was unthinkable. The morality clauses in her contracts could have ended her career overnight. The press was ruthless, and the studios even more so. Rumors were silenced, secrets buried, reputations destroyed. So their love became a secret language. They spoke of roses, of travel plans, of shared dreams that only they understood. Mercedes would send flowers, and Garbo would reply with coded gratitude. They wrote of the island, the garden, the air between us, phrases that seemed innocent to anyone else but held entire worlds of meaning for the two of them. Every word was a risk, every letter a confession hidden inside poetry. When the letters were finally unsealed, long after both women had passed, they revealed not scandal, but heartbreak. There was devotion, yes, but also distance. There was affection, but also fear. They showed how love survived in fragments, written in moments between ships, film sets, and lonely hotel rooms. They revealed two souls who, though separated by circumstance, refused to let time or distance erase what they had. In one note, Mercedes wrote as if pleading with fate itself, "You cannot know how I hunger for your presence, to see you walk into a room and feel everything change." It was the same electricity she had described from the first day they met, still alive years later. And in her quiet way, Garbo answered, never with promises, but with feeling. Their letters were never meant for the public eye. They were meant for survival, a way to speak when the world demanded silence. Each page was a heartbeat they dared not show, proof that behind Hollywood's polished facade lived two women who risked everything just to say I love you. Those words, sealed for decades, outlived them both. Hidden for half a century, they became the only witnesses to a forbidden love story that refused to fade, the love between the goddess who hid and the poet who refused to. By the mid-1930s, Hollywood had become a dream factory built on fear, a place where stories were created to escape reality, yet reality itself was censored. The Motion Picture Production Code, known as the Hays Code, ruled with an iron fist. It was more than a list of moral guidelines, it was a cultural muzzle. Under its rules, filmmakers were forbidden to depict, or even imply, same-sex relationships, adultery, or anything that challenged the era's strict moral values. Every script, every scene, every word was policed for decency. For stars like Greta Garbo, it wasn't just the screen that was censored, it was their lives. The studios owned everything. MGM, Garbo's studio, controlled her image down to the smallest detail. Her clothes, her interviews, her friendships, and even her laughter. Publicity departments crafted her mystique carefully, the divine Garbo, mysterious, pure, unattainable. It was an image that sold millions of movie tickets and preserved her power. But behind the polished facade was a woman trapped by silence. Garbo, who already feared the world's gaze, found herself imprisoned by it. She once said she disliked Hollywood parties because people talked too much. What she didn't say was that every word could become a weapon against her. For Garbo, privacy became a form of survival. She withdrew from interviews, shunned publicity, and rarely appeared at social events. To the public, her silence seemed glamorous, a cultivated mystery. But to those who knew her, it was protection. Protection from the studios, from the press, and from a world that could never understand her heart. Mercedes de Acosta, meanwhile, lived in open defiance of such control. She was the opposite of everything Hollywood demanded. She wore trousers when women were expected to wear gowns, spoke her mind when silence was safer, and loved without shame when secrecy was the rule. In artistic circles across New York and Paris, she was admired for her intellect and intensity. She wrote plays and novels that explored the complexity of desire, and she surrounded herself with dancers, poets, and revolutionaries. Mercedes didn't just live, she burned. It was inevitable that her fire and Garbo's stillness would collide. They existed at opposite ends of the same truth. Garbo's love needed the dark to survive, Mercedes' love needed the light to breathe. And yet, neither could let go. When Garbo escaped to Europe to avoid Hollywood's relentless scrutiny, Mercedes followed. The two reunited in Paris, where the air itself seemed to carry more freedom. There, they could walk along the Seine under the cover of night, two silhouettes moving through the quiet streets, their hands brushing in secret. To the world, they were simply friends, the actress and the writer, both cultured, both worldly. But those who saw them together spoke of a closeness that transcended friendship. They shared rooms in hotels, exchanged knowing glances in cafes, and spoke to each other in low tones that seemed to carry years of understanding. Every moment had to be choreographed, affection disguised as companionship, longing hidden in polite smiles. It was a cruel irony. Garbo, who could play any emotion on screen, could not show her truest one in real life. And Mercedes, whose pen could describe love in its purest form, could not live hers without risk. In Garbo's films, the boundaries between art and life began to blur. Her performances in Queen Christina, 1933, Camille, 1936, and Anna Karenina, 1935, carried a haunting authenticity that audiences could feel but not explain. In Queen Christina, she played a monarch who sacrifices love for duty, a role that mirrored her own impossible choice between her heart and her survival. There's a famous scene where Christina, dressed as a man, kisses another woman, a moment so charged, so daring, that even decades later it still feels radical. Many believe that scene was Garbo's quiet rebellion, her way of speaking through art what she could not say in life. Mercedes understood that language. When she watched Garbo on screen, she didn't just see an actress, she saw the woman she loved, bleeding truth into fiction. The tragedy of Camille, the torment of Anna Karenina, these were not mere performances. They were reflections of the emotional prison Garbo lived in, a world where love was always shadowed by sacrifice. And so, their love persisted in fragments, in coded letters, in brief meetings, in glances that lasted longer than conversations. In public, they were friends. In private, they were something the world had no name for. The Hays Code demanded silence. Hollywood enforced it. But Garbo and Mercedes found a way to speak, not with words, but with art, poetry, and the unspoken language of two souls who refused to let a forbidden love die. By the late 1930s, the light that had once bound them began to flicker. Fame, the very force that had brought Greta Garbo to Mercedes de Acosta's orbit, now became the wall between them. Garbo, always private, began to turn inward more than ever before. The world that once worshipped her now exhausted her. The endless demands of fame, the constant intrusion of the press, and the suffocating pressure from MGM left her hollow. She had built a fortress of silence to survive, but that same silence began to isolate her from the one person who truly saw her. Mercedes, on the other hand, was made of words and movement. She lived through expression, through creation, through connection. To her, love was something to be spoken, written, and felt openly, even if it cost her everything. Garbo's withdrawal felt like a betrayal to a heart that thrived on warmth. While Garbo hid behind closed doors and coded letters, Mercedes wrote openly, her pen trembling with both devotion and despair. In one of her most haunting letters, Mercedes confessed, "You shut the door between us, but my heart will not stop knocking." Those words capture the tragedy of their love, two souls in orbit, forever reaching, never landing. Garbo's silence wasn't cruelty, it was fear. Fear of exposure, of vulnerability, of losing control over the myth that sustained her. But to Mercedes, silence felt like abandonment. Their relationship turned into an emotional tug-of-war, one fought in words, pauses, and absences. Friends who knew them described them as lovers who spoke in half-truths and glances. They were seen together at times, walking quietly along New York streets, their connection palpable but undefined. Then, without explanation, Garbo would vanish into her solitude again, leaving Mercedes to wonder if love could survive on memories alone. The breaking point came not in anger, but in distance. In 1941, after the release of Two-Faced Woman, Garbo shocked the world by abruptly retiring from acting at just 36 years old. Critics had attacked her performance, audiences were divided, and the film, meant to mark her triumphant return, instead became her farewell. She never made another movie again. For a woman who had once been the brightest star in the world, she simply walked away from the light and never looked back. After leaving Hollywood, Garbo moved to New York City, seeking anonymity in its crowded streets. There, she lived quietly, walking Central Park in oversized coats and dark glasses, blending into the ordinary life she had once been denied. She refused interviews, declined public appearances, and never returned to film. The woman once worshipped by millions had finally achieved what she'd always wanted: to be alone. Mercedes remained in her orbit, though at a distance. There were rare visits, fleeting letters, and occasional glimpses of affection, but never the closeness she longed for. Garbo kept her distance, and yet she kept the letters. Every single one. She reread them through the years, even as time eroded the intensity of their bond. Sometimes she would write back, months, even years later, her words restrained, her tone soft but uncertain. It was as if Garbo could not let Mercedes go completely, yet could not bear to hold her too tightly either. For Mercedes, the silence was unbearable. The poet who had once danced through life's salons now found herself writing to an absence. Her words grew lonelier, her tone more desperate. She could feel Garbo slipping away, retreating into the shadows of her own making. And yet, she never stopped writing. She wrote because that was how she loved, fiercely, completely, even when it hurt. The distance between them wasn't measured in miles, but in the growing chasm between their worlds, one ruled by silence, the other by expression. Fame had turned Garbo into a ghost that Mercedes could no longer reach. Still, somewhere in a quiet apartment in New York, Garbo kept those letters in a locked drawer, proof that even in solitude, she was never truly alone. Their love, though faded, refused to vanish. It lingered in the unsent drafts, in the yellowed paper, in the quiet ache that followed both women into old age. It was a love story that had begun in light and ended in whispers, one woman desperate to speak, and the other destined to remain silent. By 1960, time had softened the noise of Hollywood, but for Mercedes de Acosta, the silence had become unbearable. Decades had passed since her letters with Greta Garbo had ceased, and her once vibrant social world had faded into loneliness. Many of her former lovers, actresses, dancers, and poets had either retreated into their own fame or moved on. Mercedes, now aging and financially strained, turned to the one thing she had always relied on: her words. That year, she published her memoir, Here Lies the Heart, a book that would both immortalize and destroy her. In its pages, Mercedes wrote about her extraordinary life among artists, writers, and stars. But beneath the glittering surface, she revealed something far more daring: the emotional truth of her love affairs with women, including veiled, unmistakable references to the woman who had haunted her dreams for 30 years, Greta Garbo. Mercedes never mentioned Garbo by name. She didn't have to. Her descriptions: the divine actress, the most beautiful and remote woman I ever knew, the one who feared love as much as she needed it, were so precise, so intimate, that the truth blazed through the anonymity. Those who knew, knew. It was as if Mercedes had finally opened the letters that history wasn't meant to read. For a world still unwilling to accept love between women, the memoir was explosive. Hollywood recoiled in scandal. Former friends whispered that she had gone too far. The press branded her reckless, even immoral. And for Garbo, who had spent her life building walls of privacy, who had guarded her heart and image with near-religious discipline, it was the ultimate betrayal. When the book reached her, Garbo was living quietly in New York, still cloaked in mystery. Upon reading the pages that exposed the shadows of their love, she was said to be furious, not because the words were untrue, but because they were public. For Garbo, exposure was agony. Her life had been an exercise in control, and now that control was gone. She cut off all contact with Mercedes instantly. Letters went unanswered. Visits were refused. Friends who tried to mediate were turned away. The woman who had once whispered, "I love you, I always have," vanished behind silence forever. For Mercedes, the consequences were devastating. Here Lies the Heart was supposed to be her act of liberation, a way to reclaim her truth and her place in history. Instead, it became her undoing. Hollywood shunned her, publishers distanced themselves, and friends who had once adored her disappeared overnight. She was accused of betrayal, vanity, and sensationalism. Critics mocked her. Some even called her delusional. But what they failed to see was that Mercedes wasn't seeking fame. She was seeking remembrance. She lost everything. Her money ran out. Her social invitations dried up. She moved into a small New York apartment, relying on the kindness of a few loyal friends. Her once vibrant presence, the woman who had inspired poets and danced through salons, became a shadow of itself. And yet, through the ruins of reputation, she refused to take back what she had written. She had loved truthfully, and she would not apologize for it. In her later years, when asked about Garbo, Mercedes' voice softened, stripped of bitterness. "I do not regret loving her," she said quietly. "Greta was the love of my life." There was no anger, no resentment, only remembrance. Even as poverty closed in, even as the world turned away, she carried Garbo's name like a prayer. And Garbo. She never spoke publicly about the memoir, nor about Mercedes again. But she never destroyed the letters. They remained in her possession, kept, preserved, locked away. Perhaps it was her way of remembering without forgiving. Or perhaps, deep inside, even the woman who demanded silence could not erase the echo of that love. What Mercedes revealed to the world was not scandal, but truth, the truth that behind Hollywood's shimmer lived a heart that dared to love honestly, even when it cost her everything. Here Lies the Heart was not just her memoir's title, it was her confession, her epitaph, and her final love letter to Greta Garbo. When Greta Garbo passed away in 1990, the world mourned the loss of one of cinema's greatest enigmas, the woman who had mastered silence, both on and off screen. She had lived her final years as she always had, privately, quietly, away from the noise she so despised. Yet, when her estate was opened, the truth she had guarded for nearly 60 years began to whisper from the shadows. Among her personal belongings were dozens of letters and mementos from Mercedes de Acosta, carefully folded notes, faded photographs, and envelopes worn soft from years of being read and reread. Some were neatly organized. Others were found tucked into books, drawers, and boxes as if Garbo could not bring herself to throw them away. A few were tear-stained. Each one told a story of a love that had never truly ended, even when the correspondence itself had gone silent. The discovery astonished historians. For decades, Garbo's private life had been the subject of endless speculation. Biographers had guessed, critics had hinted, and Hollywood insiders had whispered. But now, the proof lay in her own hands, the evidence she had chosen to keep, not destroy. For a woman so protective of her privacy, this preservation was almost an act of confession. It was as if Garbo, in her own quiet way, had wanted the truth to outlive her. The letters, more than 180 in total, spanning from 1931 to 1966, were eventually released by the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, where they remain today. They are not scandalous, they are heartbreakingly human. Through them, historians and readers alike began to see beyond the gossip and myth to the genuine bond between two extraordinary women. The words inside revealed a love story that was never meant for the public eye, but was every bit as real as the greatest romances of cinema. There were lines filled with longing. "I dream of seeing you and feeling your hands on my face." There were notes of frustration and silence, of distance and hope. Mercedes wrote with passion and pain. Garbo replied with restraint, yet her affection pulsed between the lines. Together, their letters painted a portrait of love both forbidden and eternal. As scholars pored over the collection, a fuller picture emerged, not just of their relationship, but of the emotional toll it took. Their letters spoke of the impossibility of being honest in a world that demanded pretense. They spoke of the Hays Code years, when affection between women could not even be shown on screen, and when the truth of one's heart could destroy a career. And yet, they also revealed resilience, the quiet rebellion of two women who refused to erase each other from their lives. For the first time, the rumors were confirmed not by tabloids or hearsay, but by their own voices. The letters proved that what history had dismissed as speculation was, in fact, one of Hollywood's most deeply hidden love stories. And while Garbo may have denied everything in life, her decision to keep those letters was an undeniable act of remembrance. In the end, the release of their correspondence did more than satisfy curiosity. It restored dignity to a love that had been buried under decades of silence. It showed that behind Garbo's legendary restraint was a woman who had loved deeply but feared greatly, and behind Mercedes' public boldness was a heart that had never stopped hoping. Through these fragile pages, time folded back on itself. The world finally saw not the divine Garbo, but Greta, a woman who, like the rest of us, longed, faltered, and loved. And in those same pages, Mercedes' voice was heard once more, as if echoing across the years, still reaching for the woman who had once changed the air in the room. In the end, truth, like love, cannot stay buried forever. It finds a way to surface, even through the quiet hands of history. Greta Garbo spent the rest of her life exactly as she had always wished, in quiet isolation, away from the cameras that had once worshipped her. She wandered the streets of New York City, wrapped in long coats and scarves, her face hidden behind dark sunglasses. In Central Park, she walked for hours, often alone, blending into the crowd as if she were a ghost from another era. To the world, she remained the divine Garbo, the woman who vanished at the height of her fame. To those who knew her best, she was simply Greta, a soul burdened by the weight of her own legend and the memories she never spoke aloud. Mercedes de Acosta, on the other hand, lived her final years in heartbreak and poverty, but never in shame. After her book Here Lies the Heart was published, she lost almost everything: her friends, her social standing, and her reputation. Yet she never retracted her words, nor denied her truth. She lived quietly in a small New York apartment, often in failing health, until her death in 1968. Among her few possessions were mementos of her past loves, and always, memories of Greta. Though she died alone, her final interviews spoke only of gratitude, not for fame, but for having known a love that, in her words, changed the rhythm of my soul. Years after both women were gone, the story they once tried to hide found its way back into the light. Through their letters, their photographs, and the whispered recollections of those who knew them, their love became more than scandal or secret, it became history. What had once been forbidden was now understood as courage. They had loved in a time when love like theirs could destroy a life. They had spoken in coded language, met behind closed doors, and suffered the silence of a world not ready to accept them. And yet, in the quiet rebellion of their hearts, they left a legacy far greater than any film or book could capture. They became symbols of truth, of the courage to love when the world demanded you hide. Today, their story stands not as tragedy, but as testament. It reminds us that love, real love, is not bound by time, gender, or fear. It may be silenced, but it cannot be erased. Their letters still whisper across decades, their words still pulse with longing, their souls still touch through history. And in that sense, Greta Garbo and Mercedes de Acosta never truly parted. Their love, once hidden in shadows, has become an eternal flame, quiet, steady, unextinguished. In the golden age of cinema, where perfection was an illusion, Greta Garbo and Mercedes de Acosta lived the most human story of all, one of love, longing, and the price of being true to oneself. As the music fades, the screen lingers on Garbo's haunting eyes, the same eyes that once held the secrets of a forbidden love. A final line appears, glowing softly against the dark. Some stories are too powerful to remain in the shadows.